Salam, salam. It's Solace121 here, and I've got a copy of the Dhammapada, translated by Ross Carter and Mahinda Paliwadhadana. And for those who don't know, this Dhammapada is verses, poems that the Buddha read to his followers way back in the day. And I wanted to open up with chapter 3, the mind. And I'm also opening on verse 40 and 41. And I'm doing it this way because, after all, these are poems. And I feel like poems are not necessarily meant to be read from linear, air quotes, beginning to end. And I feel like with poems, one can glean and gain understanding in many different ways. And there's many different openings. There's many different doors and pathways into a poem. And I feel like looking at these and approaching the Dhammapada as poetry is a little bit more accessible than typical or historically coverings of, or historically teaching of the Dhammapada and of the Buddha has been conducted. When I started out with my studies of Buddhism, the Buddha was like this high figure. He was held up like at this high standard, this high regard, and he is, and he should be held at high regard. And at the same time, I think what that does, it's a detriment to some students who are just beginning or who are also on the path for many years, is that holding him to such a high standard or a high regard kind of, it can at least give the message that his attainment is unattainable for us. And I want to just highlight the fact that Buddha was a human being. He was a human being like you and me. And to approach the Dhammapada as a collection of poetry, for me, I just have an idea that it's possible to make it more accessible and to find more openings and more ways to relate to the Buddha on a human level, to just drive home the point that we're all capable of Buddhahood, and we're all have the same basically starting point that the Buddha had. So that's why I'm opening with verse 40 and 41, because I feel like there's many different doorways and many different pathways to poetry. And if we can approach the Dhammapada as poems, which, as you can see, you see how it's laid out on the page. Like, he spoke these poems, and over time, the most logical and just way that made the most sense to put them on the page and to preserve them on the page through history was in verse format. So my way to approach poems is to basically find many different doorways. I don't necessarily read a book of poetry from start to end, although I can sometimes if I want to. But also a way to do it is to just even open at random and find a doorway in the middle of the text. So you can see here, this is chapter 3. And I'm starting with verse 40 and 41 because I feel like sometimes with poetry, and this is a hypothesis with this teaching of the Dhammapada, is that with poetry, sometimes even not beginning at the very beginning, but finding a doorway in the middle of the text or at a different point in the text, sometimes without context or without the very beginning, one can glean and come to their own conclusions and form their own questions rather than being told, like, this is how it's supposed to be done. So anyways, that's my hunch, that's my hypothesis with this form and this way of approaching the text. And this is how I approach the text on my own without a camera. So I figure, why not just stay consistent while the camera's on, approach it how I typically and regularly, formally approach it. So, verse 40 begins, knowing this body as a pot of clay, securing this mind as a citadel, one may fight Mara with wisdom's weapon, guard what has been gained, and be unattached. 41. Soon indeed this body on the earth will lie pitched aside without consciousness, like a useless chip of wood. Okay, so I'm focusing today on 40 and 41, and next week I'll focus on 42 and 43. So 40 and 41 again, I'll read once more, and then I'll have some discussion. Knowing this body as a pot of clay, securing this mind as a citadel, one might fight Mara with wisdom's weapon, guard what has been gained, and be unattached. Soon indeed this body on the earth will lie, pitched aside, without consciousness, like a useless chip of wood. So the first thing that stands out in my mind is, of course, the first line, knowing this body as a pot of clay. And what I want to do is discuss the comparison between this body and a pot of clay. So when he says knowing this body, he's speaking of, this body being all human bodies. But also it could be this body as far as this celestial body, this body of combined mind, body, spirit, right? But I'm going to focus on just this physical body, the aspect of this physical body, this human body, and that also being translated to all human bodies. But then also, since it's a poem, he could be speaking of all bodies in general, like lizard bodies and coyote bodies and beaver bodies and hummingbird bodies. So it's got many layers, but what I want to tune in and focus on is just this, when I'm speaking of this line right now, is just this human body. It could be my body, it could be your body, and then comparing that to a pot of clay. And how, basically, I want to talk about how a pot of clay is created, is made, and that might illumine something about how the characteristics of this human body is made and created and continues in this realm. So what are the characteristics of a clay pot, where he says knowing this body as a pot of clay? Well, a clay pot is made of dirt, soil, earth, and water. And how is it made? Well, typically a clay pot is spun at a speed that's quick so that you can formulate something of a shape of a circular pot shape. And that's how it's made. So it's you quickly spin a surface and then form the clay with water around something that you're formulating it. And it's quick movements. So you're moving the matter very quickly and very fast. Yet when it's done, when you dry and you heat the wet materials to dry it, and when it's done, when the pot is actually completed, the way that it's utilized and the way that it stays safe is that it's still. So when, like, if you're putting flowers in the pot, or you're putting soup in the pot, the pot of clay is actually still. Okay, so and connecting this to the human body, I liken the stillness of the utilizing a clay pot. When it's best utilized, it's still. You're using it as a flower vase, or you're eating from it. You're not spinning it anymore. You're not moving it around. So I liken that to stilling the body would be meditating. So there's a comparison between a clay pot and this body, but also beneath the surface is he's illuminating to meditation. So also the clay pot, when it's being created, it's spun, you're spinning the materials, yet when it's done and it's completed, the way it also stays safe and the way that you keep from breaking it is that you keep it in a safe place. And it's still. You're not throwing it, you're not moving it, you're not putting it on any surfaces that are shaking. Similar to the human body, when one is meditating, when you're still and you're unmoved, then the mind becomes still as well. So the clay pot is likened to a human body on the first line of verse 40 there. Also, the human body stays still so that what's inside the human body is your brain connected to your mind, that becomes still as well, and that becomes, safe and sound. Whereas when the clay pot is still and it's being utilized to its best capacity, it's not being shaken, so it's not going to break. And what's inside the clay pot is also safe and sound. So I want to just highlight that off the first line. That's a very rich line, and there's a lot there even in that one line. So he goes on from there saying, knowing this body as a pot of clay, securing this mind as a citadel. So again, he's illuminating what's inside the pot of clay, what's inside the body. Although the mind isn't just relegated to the body, part of the mind is in the body. Part of the body is in the mind too. But I just want to highlight right now, securing the mind as a citadel. So he's speaking of what we, as our, in air quotes, individual consciousness, we experience the mind as like this body moving through space and time. And the brain is connected to the mind. So the mind being inside the body. And again, this body doesn't necessarily just mean this individual body. So there's multiple layers being woven here. But for now, I'm just focusing on my individual body and this brain, which is connected to the mind. And he says, securing the mind as a citadel. So a citadel is a fortress, okay? So basically, again, it's that stillness that's being alluded to. When the pot of clay is still, what's inside the pot of clay is at peace and is protected against the elements or against whatever may be outside of that pot of clay. So just as the mind in the body and securing the mind as a citadel, how do you secure what's in a pot of clay? You keep it still and you keep it in a safe, sturdy surface. Just like securing the mind as a citadel, keep that pot of clay still and the mind is protected. Alluding to meditation, as the body in meditation is still, the mind is protected. And then one may fight Mara with wisdom's weapon. Guard what has been gained and be unattached. Soon indeed this body on the earth will lie, pitched aside without consciousness, like a useless chip of wood. So, again, the body is being spoken about from the first line of verse 40. This body is a pot of clay. And then at the conclusion of verse 41, then he's likening the body to a useless chip of wood. Although also that's the overt subject, but what's underneath the surface is also, this is the chapter called the mind. So what's being woven in and out of the subjectivity is the relationship between mind and body. And soon indeed, so he's also playing with time when he says soon indeed this body on the earth will lie. So we have a few actually many different subjects and many different approaches to enter this verse. So I want to focus on the three is body, mind, and now time. When he says soon indeed this body on the earth will lie, pitched aside without consciousness, like a useless chip of wood. So before he goes to say a useless chip of wood, we can still carry this metaphor of a pot of clay and the body as a pot of clay. So when he says soon indeed this body on the earth will lie, pitched aside, we're still carrying the pot of clay as it's likened to the body, because he hasn't given us anything new, any new metaphor or simile to connect to the body. So a pot of clay that's pitched aside, what happens to it? It breaks. It's cracked. And when would you typically throw a pot of clay that has use to you, would you typically throw it aside? No, not typically. If you're using a pot of clay, or if a pot is useful to you, you're not typically throwing it aside. So, soon indeed this body on the earth will lie, pitched aside. Basically, the timing of that also means when the body is no longer of use to you and to the world and to the divine purpose that we all have within ourselves and a reason for our being here, that's when the body on the earth will lie pitched aside. Similarly to a clay pot, when it's no longer of use, it can be thrown aside, and then it breaks. So we're still dealing with the metaphor of the pot of clay at this point, until he says on the last line of verse 41, pitched aside without consciousness like a useless chip of wood. But again, what makes a chip of wood useless? Well, one way a chip of wood could be useless is if it's not included with other chips of wood so that it can together burn, or that it can together be built and combined to make a surface, such as a desk. So if you just have one chip of wood, you're not really building anything. Or if you're wanting to have a fire, you have one chip of wood, it's not gonna have other chips of wood to catch fire. Also, what makes the chip of wood useless? If it's wet, which connects to the first line of a pot of clay. Again, how do you form a pot of clay? You have water combined with that earth and that soot and that material that makes clay. But the clay has to be wet for it to form, and then it has to dry. But here he ends verse 41 with a useless chip of wood. One thing that makes a chip of wood useless is if it's wet. So there's many different layers to just these two verses, 40 and 41 of chapter 3 of the mind, which is alluding to and working with the idea that the mind has many different layers. The mind has many different entrances and many different rooms and many different levels. So the great thing about this, what I love about the Dhammapada and about the Buddha's teachings in general, is as a student, I can connect on many different levels, and he has many different entrances and many different availabilities, so that I don't have to comprehend every single thing that he's saying, and I don't have to understand every single aspect of his teaching. But what I can do is I can continue sitting with it, continue working with it, continue spending time with the Buddha's teachings, with the Dharma. And each time something new can be illuminated, something more can be added to my knowledge, to my richness of just understanding and working with and learning, and something like a new angle can be approached, or something new that I didn't necessarily understand before. And each session becomes like a new exploration, which is similarly why I love poetry. And again, here's the cover. So folks who are seeing this for the first time, who maybe don't know the Dhammapada, here's what it looks like, this particular translation. And just the richness of lessons and the richness of wisdom is clearly just apparent. And it's just lovely to sit with this book and to sit with the sutras and to contemplate and to meditate on the Buddha's teachings. All right, that's it. Salam, salam.